The winter wind tore through Boston that night like a blade dipped in salt, sharp enough to cut through breath, blood, and loyalty in a single stroke. It carried the warning of a blizzard the morning papers would only dare to call historic, the kind that comes once in 70 years. And on Beacon Hill, behind the iron gates of the Bianchi estate, 27-year-old Calum Bianchi felt that warning settle into his jawbone the moment the black Cadillac rolled to a stop. Something was wrong tonight. The men guarding the gate, men he'd known since he was 10, looked at him differently. Not with fear, not with respect, with pity. And when the hounds in the courtyard didn't bark as he passed, but simply stood watching him with the silence of creatures who already know how a story ends, he understood that someone was going to die before sunrise, and his father was waiting to see whose side he'd choose. What Calum didn't know yet was that the bleeding black mastiff chained to a stone pillar in the cellar beneath that estate would cost him everything: his name, his inheritance, his empire, his family in less than 10 minutes. He didn't know that the old man he'd called father for 27 years had been lying to him since the day he was born. He didn't know that the woman who'd open her clinic door to him at 3 a.m, a stranger with blood on his hands and a dying dog in his arms, would 9 years later become the only person on earth who could destroy him or save him. All he knew, as he stepped out into the snow toward a father's voice and a loaded Beretta, was that the Bianchi name was about to demand a price from him, and he was about to find out he wasn't willing to pay it. If you believe loyalty is worth more than blood, if you believe the quiet ones are the most dangerous, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to that night in Boston where the snow was falling, the dog was bleeding, and a mafia prince was about to lose everything he'd ever been promised. The wine cellar beneath the Beacon Hill mansion was cold, in a way entirely different from the storm outside. The cold here didn't cut the skin. It seeped into the bones with the slow patience of 100-year-old granite, of Barolo bottles lined up in the dark, of secrets buried beneath this floor longer than the life of the man now stepping onto the final stair. Calum Bianchi counted 19 steps. He had walked these steps since he was 6 years old, usually following his father, usually to learn a lesson that even now he still didn't fully understand. But tonight, for the first time in 27 years, he realized these steps didn't lead down to a wine cellar. They led down to a trial. Yellow light from 6 incandescent bulbs hanging from the oak beams spilled over a wide circle in the middle of the cellar. And inside that circle, an animal was dying. A 1-year-old black mastiff lay on its side across the stone floor, its neck chained to a granite pillar that stood as high as an adult man's waist. A carbon hunting arrow was buried deep in its right shoulder. The shaft snapped into 2, as though someone had tried to break it out, and then stopped halfway through. Blood dripped onto the stone, 1 drop at a time, forming a pool as dark as spilled wine. The dog didn't whine. It only breathed, and with every breath it pushed out a cloud of pale vapor into the cold air, fading, then vanishing as though even its breath knew where it was going. Tommaso Bianchi stood on the opposite side of the circle, a glass of 30-year-old Macallan whiskey in one hand, wearing a charcoal gray wool coat from an Italian tailor on Hanover Street. His silver hair brushed neatly back like a university professor's. He wasn't looking at the dog. He was looking at his son. And when Calum stepped into the ring of light, his father smiled in the way Calum had learned long ago never to trust. A smile wide enough, warm enough, and utterly empty. Giovanni stood at his father's right, 23 years old, half a head taller than him, one hand tucked into his trouser pocket with the lazy ease of someone who already knew how this would end. One corner of his mouth curled when he saw Calum. Not quite a smile, more like a silent remark, the kind that said his brother was late, and this party was for him. 4 capos stood in an arc behind Tommaso: Vincenzo Mazzola, Salvo Greco, Dante Lombardo, and Rocco Ferraro. Calum knew the names of their wives, knew the names of their children, had eaten at their tables for 20 years. Tonight, none of them looked him straight in the eye. "You're right on time," Tommaso said, his voice as soft as wind passing through silk curtains. "I've always valued that in you, Calum. Being on time is the first respect a man can offer another man." He set the whiskey glass down on an oak barrel, drew a black Beretta 92 FS from the inside pocket of his coat, the kind the Bianchi family had used for 3 generations, and offered the grip toward Calum. "Do you know this dog?" "No. Of course you don't. It belongs to Salvatore Caruso." "Caruso. You remember him, don't you? the man who kept the books for the Chelsea docks for 7 years until last month, when I discovered he'd stolen $412,000 from us over the course of 3 years. He said the number in the tone of a man reading the morning stock prices. I dealt with Caruso last night. Clean, quiet. But this dog, Calum, this dog was there when it happened. This is the last living witness. And in this family, witnesses aren't allowed to live longer than the story. Calum didn't take the gun. He looked at the dog. The dog looked at him. For one moment, no longer than half a heartbeat, those dark golden eyes met his steel-gray ones, and Calum felt something fall from very high up inside his chest. Tommaso still held the gun out. His voice was still smooth, still warm, still the voice of a father teaching his son an important lesson. "Shoot it, son. This is ritual. You're 27 years old now, Calum. It's time you understood how heavy the name Bianchi feels in your hand." Outside, the wind wailed through the cellar's ventilation pipe. A long, hoarse sound, almost human, and the black dog kept breathing, one pale cloud after another, as though it were counting down the breaths it had left in front of a man it had never met, never known, and never harmed. Calum didn't take the gun. He stepped once toward the dog, then one more step, then knelt on the granite floor, so cold that it seeped through the wool of his trousers within seconds. The pool of blood beneath the animal's shoulder had spread to the tips of his Italian leather shoes. But he didn't notice. He placed his bare hand on the mastiff's neck, just beneath the iron chain, and felt its heartbeat. Slow, very slow, but still there. The dog didn't flinch when he touched it. It only turned its eyes up to look at him, and that was when Calum saw it. Those dark golden eyes, in the incandescent light of the wine cellar, weren't the eyes of an animal waiting to die. They were the eyes of a creature that had already given everything and had nothing left to fear. And Calum had seen those eyes before, 15 years earlier. In the room on the second floor of this mansion, on a 4-poster bed, where his mother, Isabella Bianchi, had lain through the final 6 months of her life, growing so thin that her wedding ring slipped from her finger whenever she slept. He was 12 that night. She had held his hand with a hand made of nothing but bone and tendon, and she had whispered 3 words through her cracked lips, 3 words he had buried so deeply that he had thought he had forgotten them. "Don't become them." Calum let out a long breath. He rose to his feet. The dog's blood had soaked from the knees of his trousers up to his thighs, a dark stain spreading like an accusation. He turned to look at the man who had called himself his father for 27 years, gave a single, small shake of his head, then said in a voice so calm that even he was surprised by it, "No, I'm taking him." The air in the wine cellar froze. Vincenzo Mazzola drew in a breath that could be heard in the silence. Rocco Ferraro lowered his eyes. Giovanni lifted his head, and the crooked half-smile vanished from his mouth, replaced by something sharper, hungrier, almost delighted. But Tommaso Bianchi remained still. He looked at Calum for 1 second, then 2, then 3. And in those 3 seconds, Calum watched the face of the man who had taught him to tie a necktie, who had taken him to his first Red Sox game, who had stood behind him at his graduation from Boston Latin, slowly disappear. In its place was a face Calum had never seen on his father before, yet recognized at once, because it was exactly the face his mother had been looking at during the last 6 months of her life. Tommaso pointed his index finger straight at Calum's face, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer smooth. It cracked into something cold and sharp. "You're weak." The finger trembled once. "You're weak exactly like your mother. 27 years I raised you. 27 years I taught you to carry this name. And you bow your head for an animal bleeding on the floor of my house? Get out. Get out of my house. From tonight on, you're no son of mine. No name. No money. No Bianchi blood runs in you anymore." Calum didn't answer. He bent down, removed the iron chain from the dog's neck with hands that didn't tremble, slid one arm beneath its chest and the other beneath its hindquarters, then lifted the animal up. 150 pounds of flesh, bone, and blood pressed into his chest, making the bloodstain across his white shirt spread over nearly his entire upper body. The dog didn't struggle. It only rested its head in the hollow of his neck, as if it had decided long ago who it would trust in its final moment. Calum stepped out of the circle of light. The 4 capos moved aside by instinct. No one dared touch him. No one dared say a word. As he passed Giovanni, the younger brother he had carried in his arms on the day he was born, Giovanni tilted his head toward him and whispered, just loud enough for the two of them to hear. "Good luck out there, brother. Or die out there. Your choice." Calum didn't turn his head. He climbed the 19 steps, shoved the heavy oak door open with his shoulder, and stepped out into the howling snowstorm over Beacon Hill, carrying a dying dog and 3 words from a woman who had died 15 years earlier. The iron gates of the Bianchi mansion closed behind Calum with a metallic groan he would remember for the remaining 9 years of his life. No one came to open the gate for him as he left. No one turned on the back lights after he passed through. There was only the snowstorm, and the cold waiting for him like an old acquaintance. Powdered snow lashed his face, his lashes, his hair, and after the first 300 meters, his Italian leather shoes had already become 2 blocks of wet ice. He had no wallet, no phone, no car keys. All of those things had been locked in Tommaso's safe from the moment he stepped through the gate that night, because that was the ritual, because a son coming to receive his lesson didn't bring his own life with him. All he had was a 150-pound mastiff bleeding down the front of his shirt, a wool coat too thin for a night of historic storm, and 3 words from his dead mother. He walked south. There was no clear reason, only instinct. Beacon Hill was to his north, and everything in his life had just been forbidden in the north. He passed along Charles Street, where the old gas lamps were nothing now but faint yellow halos inside the thick curtain of snow. Not a single car passed. Boston had shut down that night. After the first mile, the dog's blood had dried across his chest, but fresh blood still seeped beneath its shoulder. After the second mile, Calum's hands had gone so numb that he had to check with his eyes to make sure they were still holding the dog. After the 3rd mile, he stopped beneath the awning of a Catholic church on Tremont Street to catch his breath, and the dog opened its eyes and looked at him, just for a second. Then it closed them again. Calum whispered into its ear in a hoarse voice, "Not tonight. You don't get to die tonight. I won't forgive you if you die tonight." And he kept walking. The memory came to him somewhere between the 3rd mile and the 4th, not as a thought, but as a scent. Eucalyptus. Antiseptic. His mother's voice, very weak, on an afternoon in April 15 years earlier, when she lifted her white Persian cat into the car and said to the driver, "Take me to Holloway in Dorchester. Don't take me to your father's doctor. Mrs. Holloway will know what to do." Calum had been 12 then, sitting in the back seat. He had never spoken that name again to anyone, had never thought of it again, until tonight. Holloway Veterinary Clinic, Dorchester. His mother had trusted that person more than she trusted her own family doctor, and at the time he had wondered why. But he had never been brave enough to ask. Now he knew why. Because his mother had been teaching him something she couldn't say aloud, leaving him an address in case one day he needed someone who didn't carry the name Bianchi. Calum walked more than another mile, cutting across Mass Avenue, through Roxbury asleep beneath the storm, and reached Dorchester just as the clock in the Protestant church tower struck 3 in the morning. The clinic stood on a small street just off Dorchester Avenue, a 2-story wooden house painted a worn-out blue, with a simple sign hanging over the front door. Holloway Veterinary Clinic, established in 1984. The first-floor windows were dark. One second-floor window held a faint yellow light. Calum lowered the dog onto the front steps as gently as he could with 2 hands that no longer had any feeling, then raised his fist and pounded on the wooden door. Once, twice, a 3rd time, harder. He didn't know how long he stood there. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. But then the door cracked open, and warm yellow light spilled across the snow like a blade. A middle-aged woman stood in the doorway, wearing metal-framed glasses and an old gray sweater tangled with cat hair. And she looked from Calum's blood-covered face down to the dying dog at his feet, then back to his face, without expression. Behind her, at the top of the wooden staircase leading to the 2nd floor, a young woman was standing with a book still in her hand, honey-brown hair twisted into a loose knot, an oversized flannel sweater hanging from her shoulders, gray-blue eyes wide as she stared at the bloodied stranger on her doorstep. The middle-aged woman spoke first. Her voice was low, slow, unhurried, as though opening the door to bloodied men at 3 in the morning was not an unfamiliar thing after 30 years in practice. "Bring him in. Surgery room is to the left." The girl on the staircase let her book fall onto the carpet, never taking her eyes off Calum for even a second, and started down. Calum carried the dog into the surgery room the way the woman with glasses had directed him. The room was smaller than he had expected, but so clean its discipline could be seen on every surface. and the white halogen lights overhead snapped on the moment the young woman touched the switch. A stainless steel operating table stood in the center. A glass medicine cabinet occupied the right corner. An old anesthesia machine, polished until it shone, stood in the left. Everything in the room said this place wasn't wealthy, but had been cared for by the hands of someone who loved the work. Calum lowered the mastiff onto the table, and the instant the weight left his chest, both his arms began to shake beyond his control. The middle-aged woman closed the door, went straight to the sink, rolled up the sleeves of her wool sweater, and began washing her hands with iodine soap with a steadiness Calum hadn't seen in anyone in the wine cellar that night. "I'm Marlene Holloway," she said without turning around. "This is my daughter, Winter. She's in her first year of her pre-veterinary studies at Tufts, and tonight she'll assist me because I don't have any other help at this hour. You don't need to tell me your name if you don't want to, but I do need to know a few things." She dried her hands on a clean towel, pulled on sterile gloves, and for the first time looked directly at Calum through the metal rims of her glasses. "Does this dog carry any infection? Is it fully vaccinated? And this arrow, how long ago was it fired?" Calum shook his head. "I don't know. He's not mine. I just took him away." Marlene looked at him for a second, then nodded as if that answer was enough. She didn't ask another question. Winter entered the room after washing her hands, her hair now tied neatly back, and for the first time Calum truly looked at her. She came up to his shoulder, her face still holding the softness of 18, but her hands already had the shape of a surgeon's, long-fingered and steady. She didn't say a word. She simply took her place across from her mother at the operating table and set a stainless steel tray of instruments beside her hand. Calum stepped back until he was against the wall. He removed the Patek Philippe from his wrist, the watch Tommaso had given him on his 21st birthday, with a speech about legacy, about bloodlines, about how the time of a Bianchi man was worth more than anyone else's. He set it down on the small stainless steel table beside the door. "I don't have any money on me," he said. His voice was rough from snow, and from not having spoken for more than an hour. "But this is worth $48,000. If the dog lives, it's yours." Marlene didn't look at the watch. She was sliding an IV needle into the vein in the dog's front leg, and she answered without lifting her head. "Keep your watch. We take patients, not watches. If you want to thank us, then someday be kind to some creature that can't defend itself. That's the only kind of debt I recognize." Calum didn't know how to answer that. No one had refused money from him in 27 years. He only stood there against the wall and watched. The surgery lasted 5 hours. Winter worked in silence under her mother's direction, passing instruments, holding clamps, changing gauze, transfusing blood from the small canine blood bank in the clinic refrigerator. Marlene removed the carbon arrow a fraction at a time, stitched the torn subclavian artery, set the cracked shoulder blade, and through all 5 hours, she didn't speak more than 20 words. By the time dawn was near, Calum had sunk down to the floor against the wall because his legs could no longer hold him. And at some point in the 4th hour, Winter glanced toward him, met his eyes, and he saw that she wasn't afraid of him. She was only checking whether he was all right. When the sun began to rise beyond the window, Marlene removed her gloves, dropped them into the medical waste bin, and said in a tired but even voice, "He'll live. The right shoulder will never be as strong as it was. Give him 6 weeks of rest. No running, no jumping. If you've got nowhere to go, you can leave him here for the first 2 days. After that, you're on your own." Calum rose to his feet and nodded. He looked at the watch still lying on the stainless steel table. He meant to pick it up again, then stopped himself. He turned to the young woman who was taking off her surgical gown, the one who had stood for 5 hours without sitting down even once. "Your name is Winter." It wasn't a question. He only wanted to hear that name one more time, to make sure he would remember it. She lifted her head. "Winter Holloway." Calum nodded and said nothing more. He walked out the door into the gray light of morning after the snowstorm and disappeared into the empty Dorchester Street. After he was gone, Winter turned back to the stainless steel table. The Patek Philippe was still lying there, cold and silent, reflecting the halogen light. She could hear her mother cleaning instruments in the next room. She picked up the watch, felt its weight in the center of her palm, and opened the bottom drawer of the medical records cabinet, the one her mother never opened. She placed the watch at the bottom of the drawer beneath a stack of old papers and closed it. Her mother wouldn't ask. Her mother never asked about things Winter didn't say aloud. Winter stood in the surgery room for a long time, looking at the black dog breathing steadily on the table, and wondered what exactly she had just kept in that drawer. A debt, a promise, or only a fragment of a night she knew she would never forget. Caleb's first year after the night on Beacon Hill wasn't a year of living, but a year of refusing to die. He returned to Holloway Clinic on the third day to take the dog back, and this time Marlene didn't ask him to pay anything at all, only handed him a plastic bag with antibiotics inside and a slip of paper with the dosage written in longhand. Winter wasn't at the clinic that day. She was at Tufts. Maybe that was better for both of them. Caleb rented a corner of an abandoned warehouse in the Chelsea docks, $300 a month paid in cash to a man who didn't ask for papers, and he lived there with the black mastiff inside 4 rusted tin walls, a mattress bought from a liquidation store, and an oil lamp, because he didn't want to sign an electric contract under any name at all. He worked as a dock laborer, 3 shifts a day at the port, $12 an hour, under the name Caleb Moore. During the first 2 weeks, the dog still couldn't stand, and Caleb had to carry him outside himself every time he needed to relieve himself. By the 5th week, he could limp beside him to the docks in the morning and wait outside the fence for 8 hours, never barking, never whining, only lying there and watching. One night in early March, while the oil lamp was burning low, Caleb lay down on the mattress and the dog lay down beside him for the first time, pressing his back against Caleb's hip to keep warm. Caleb placed a hand on his head and spoke softly into the empty space of the warehouse. "Wherever you follow me, I won't know where we're going either. So from now on, I'm calling you Shadow, the only shadow that didn't leave me." The dog let out a long breath. The name stayed with him from that night on. In the second year, Caleb had grown used to walking through the alleys of Chelsea at 2 a.m. on his way home from the night shift, and it was in one alley like that, on a night in November, that a man in a black leather jacket stepped out from behind a dumpster and pointed a switchblade at him. The man wanted his wallet. Caleb didn't have a wallet. That was probably why the man used the knife for real. Caleb avoided the first strike by turning his shoulder, but the second one carved a long gash across his left forearm, and he had only just seen the man readying the third swing when Shadow was there. The dog, now weighing 150 pounds, and able to run on 3 strong legs, launched himself at the man's throat from the left side, and all Caleb heard was a dry snap, a choked grunt, then silence. The man in the leather jacket lay face down on the wet pavement, and when Caleb pulled Shadow away, his mouth was bloody all the way down to his chest. Caleb looked at the body, then at Shadow, then did the only thing he could do. He carried Shadow back to the warehouse, washed his mouth with warm salt water, and sat with him all night. The dog trembled. He trembled without stopping from 2 a.m. until dawn. Not from cold, but from something Caleb had seen in many men in the wine cellar, and never before in an animal. He held him and whispered into his ear words he had never said to anyone. "Me too. The first time is never easy. Never." In the 3rd year, on an August morning at Revere Beach, Caleb was eating breakfast at the cannoli shop of an old man named Enzo Girolamo when 3 Russians from the Bratva crew in East Boston came in to collect that month's protection money. Enzo was 82, had been making pastries on that corner since 1968, and he made cannoli exactly like the kind Caleb's mother used to make in the Beacon Hill kitchen on Sunday afternoons when Tommaso was away. Enzo didn't have the money that month. One of the 3 Russians slapped him. Caleb rose from the table. He didn't say a word. He only stood up. 3 days later, those 3 Russians were found in 3 different places along the Revere shoreline. Not dead, but never again able to collect protection money from anyone, and Enzo Girolamo was never asked for payment again. That was the first time the name Caleb Bianchi was whispered on certain streets of Boston as something other than Tommaso's exiled son. In the 4th year, Caleb walked into an Irish bar in Southie called the Black Shamrock on a night in February, and he found a 40-year-old man sitting in the far corner with his 6th glass of cheap whiskey, an old, faded marine jacket, and 2 large hands with a slight tremor in the knuckles. The man's name was Rafael Moreno. He had served 14 years in the Marine Corps, gone to Fallujah 3 times, and had been dishonorably discharged after that because he refused to give false testimony in a military investigation into the death of an Iraqi civilian. He had lost all his benefits, lost his family, and was drinking himself to death in Southie because he had no other reason left to wake up. Caleb sat down across from him, placed a thick envelope on the table, and said 3 sentences. "My name is Caleb Bianchi. I don't need a soldier. I need a man who still believes in something, even after being betrayed for believing in it. If you're still sober tomorrow morning, come to the address inside the envelope. If not, I understand." The next morning, Rafael Moreno stood at the door of the Chelsea warehouse at 6:45, clean-shaven, with no glass of whiskey in his hand, and Shadow was the first creature of that new world to go out and greet him. The 5th year was the year Calum stopped living alone. The second person to come after Raphael was a 51-year-old man named Silas Donovan, freshly released from Walpole State Prison after serving 16 years for organized theft, once the finest lockpicker in New England, before a partner sold him out on their final job. Calum found him sleeping in a shelter in Quincy, and he said only one sentence: "I don't care what you did. I care what you'll do next." The third was Marin Volkov, 33 years old, chief accountant for an investment firm in Brookline, who had been beaten by her husband for 7 years and was sitting in a shelter for abused women in Watertown when Raphael found her with an address and an offer. She cut her hair close to the scalp in her first month working for Calum, a cut she called cutting away 7 years, and after that she never let it grow long again. The fourth was Akhmed Kasanov, 29, a former elite sniper in the Russian military who had deserted during the Second Chechen War and lived underground in the United States under 3 different names for 7 years. By the end of the 5th year, the group had grown to 9 people. Not one of them had been accepted by any decent world. Calum never gave the group a name. Shadow did, because Shadow always followed any newcomer to the warehouse for the first 3 days, sniffing, watching, then either lying at their feet or silently leaving the room. And after the 5th year, Raphael began jokingly calling the people. Shadow accepted the strays Shadow brought home. The name stayed. The Strays. In the 6th year, Calum went to Providence to meet a bootleg liquor contact, and he knew it was a trap before he entered the warehouse. But he went in anyway, because he needed to know who had said it. It was the first time he had crossed paths with Tommaso's men since the night on Beacon Hill. 4 gunmen. He took down 2 with a Sig Sauer P226 and 1 with a knife, but the 4th shot him 3 times, once in the left hip, once in the right shoulder, and once grazing his ribs. Calum fell outside the warehouse into wet snow, and he heard his own voice whispering his mother's name, then Shadow's name, then nothing at all. When he woke, he was in the emergency room at Rhode Island Hospital, and the attending doctor was telling him that his dog had dragged him 800 meters through the snow by clamping onto the collar of his coat, across 3 intersections, then lying down right in front of the hospital's revolving door until someone saw them. When he was discharged 3 weeks later, Shadow still had Calum's blood dried into a crust along the fur at the back of his neck. He never washed that crust away. It fell out naturally over time. And when the last strand dropped in July of that year, Calum knew it was time to stop running. In the 7th year, Calum bought the old port warehouse where he had once worked for $12 an hour, warehouse number 3 in Chelsea Harbor. He paid in cash, $3,200,000, through a shell company in Delaware. 2 weeks later, a new sign was hung across the front. Bianchi Imports. Not a disguise. Not another name. The name Bianchi, written in heavy black brass letters against granite, facing straight toward Boston Bay. That was the first signal Calum sent to the man on the Beacon Hill rise. "I'm alive. I'm here. And I'm using the name you stripped from me." 4 months later, on a December morning, Calum stepped out of a breakfast restaurant in the North End and was about to get into his black Range Rover when Shadow suddenly stopped 3 steps from the car door, let out a low growl Calum had never heard from him before, and backed away. Calum understood. Before he could move out of the blast radius, the vehicle erupted into a pillar of red fire, and shattered glass drove into the left side of his jaw, leaving a scar 2 inches long that he would carry for the rest of his life. When he was sitting in Raphael's car 5 minutes later, one hand pressed to the wound, Shadow lying at his feet, Calum said only one sentence. "Next time he'll come closer. We have to get closer first." The 8th and 9th years passed in quiet expansion. By the autumn of the present year, when Calum turned 36, the Strays had 47 permanent members and more than 100 contacts scattered across New England. They controlled 4 small ports in Massachusetts Bay, 2 cross-border shipping routes through Canada, and 11% of Boston's total underground market share. It wasn't the biggest number, but it was enough to keep Tommaso Bianchi from sleeping anymore. Shadow was 10 now, walking more slowly, sleeping more, carrying a diagonal scar along his right flank from the night in Providence. But every time Calum stepped out the door, The dog still rose, still followed, still remained the only shadow that hadn't left him in 9 years. And through all 9 of those years, Calum never once went back to Dorchester. On the other side of the city, in a worn blue 2-story wooden house on a small street just off Dorchester Avenue, another life was stepping into its longest night without knowing it yet. Winter Holloway sat at the desk on the first floor of the clinic at 11 o'clock that night, wearing glasses, her honey-brown hair twisted into the same loose knot she had worn since she was 18, but her face was different now. 27 years old, and there were nights when she looked into the bathroom mirror and didn't recognize herself anymore. In front of her, on the worn, smooth surface of the oak desk, lay a thick, cream-colored envelope from Eastern Bank, stamped with today's date. Notice of default, 90 days to pay the remaining mortgage balance of $127,000. Or Holloway Clinic would enter foreclosure proceedings. 12% of her family's assets had been tied up in these walls. Her mother had hung the Holloway Veterinary Clinic sign on the porch in 1984, and now, 6 years after Marlene's death, with that name still hanging there 20 minutes by car from Mass General, the bank was preparing to take it down. Winter set the envelope aside and pressed 2 fingers against her temple. She hadn't cried in 4 months and 11 days. She kept count in her head. Not because she wanted to, but because her mind wouldn't let her forget. The day Marlene died of pancreatic cancer at 53, Winter was 21, and still 9 months short of graduating from Tufts. But Rowan was only 8 then, newly diagnosed with a congenital ventricular septal defect, and there was no one else left in this world to care for him. Their father, Dean Holloway, had become a man she stopped calling father when she was 15, a drunk and a gambling addict who had walked out one night in March, 4 years earlier, leaving behind $180,000 in mob debt that creditors tracked all the way to the last Holloway siblings, still living in the house. Winter had dropped out during her final year at Tufts. She finished her veterinary degree through a part-time program over 4 years, studying while keeping her mother's clinic alive, while taking Rowan to Boston Children's Hospital 4 times a year. She had a Massachusetts DVM license in the top drawer, a piece of paper that had saved her from many things but hadn't saved her from numbers. 3 jobs a day, from 6 in the morning until 10 in the morning, at her own clinic. From 11 until 4 in the afternoon at the emergency center at Angel Memorial. From 5 in the evening until 11 at night doing house calls for families who couldn't bring their pets to the clinic. On weekends, she treated poor families for free, the same way Marlene used to. She didn't know how much longer she could keep the clinic's doors open, or how she would protect Rowan from the debt collectors who still remembered their father's name. The weight of the world felt as heavy as the frozen silence in the surgery room, leaving her with no answers, only a tired hope that somehow the shadows of the past would finally stay buried. The following night, Calum had a dinner meeting at Trattoria Lucano in the North End, a family restaurant that had been open for 63 years on Hanover Street. It was a meeting with a wine importer from Naples, a deal Raphael had checked 3 times through 3 different sources and found no sign of trouble in. Calum arrived at 7:45, Shadow at his side, Raphael in the second car at the corner, and 2 other strays stationed at opposite ends of the street. His table was at the very back of the restaurant, with the wall behind him. He finished his first glass of Barolo at 8:15, and was cutting into his second piece of lamb when Shadow, beneath the table, suddenly lifted his head. He didn't growl. He only stared straight at the front door, and that was the moment Calum knew this evening was no longer the evening he had walked into. 3 men in charcoal gray overcoats entered the restaurant. None of the 3 looked hungry. Raphael, through the earpiece in Calum's ear, had only enough time to say 2 words, Albanian men, before the first bullet tore through the wine bottle on the table and lodged in the brick wall behind Calum. He was already rolling off his chair before the second shot came. That night at Trattoria Lucano, which lasted no more than 90 seconds but killed 4 people and wounded 3 unrelated dinner guests, was the first night since Providence that Calum knew he wasn't going to make it home. Raphael and 2 strays came in through the back entrance and dropped 2 Albanian shooters with 3 close-range shots to the face before they could reload. But the 3rd gunman got off 2 shots into Calum. One went through his left side, one buried itself in his right thigh, and while Raphael was dragging Calum away, Shadow lunged at the 3rd shooter. But this time there wasn't only a gun. The man also had a knife, and Shadow took 2 deep knife wounds to his left hind leg and flank before Raphael could shoot him dead. They got out through the back kitchen door, through an alley thick with the smell of cooking oil and autumn rain, and stopped at a refrigerated truck loaded with beef that was parked at the end of the alley, the kind Raphael had arranged in advance as a backup plan 2 years earlier. Calum was laid on the floor of the truck among empty meat hooks. Shadow was placed beside him. Raphael slammed the rear doors shut, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. The truck left the north end at 8:54. Calum bled onto the cold metal floor, his white shirt no longer white anywhere. His breathing was short and broken. Beside him, Shadow breathed with a wet, bloody rasp. The black fur on his chest soaked and heavy. Calum slid his hand beneath the dog's neck and held his head against his forearm. Raphael, from the driver's seat, spoke through the divider in the steady voice of a man who had once stayed calm under RPG fire in Fallujah. Mass General is being watched. Beth Israel is being watched. Tufts Medical Center isn't safe because Winter's brother is being treated there. Brigham has had Tommaso's people in it since last year. We don't have a hospital, Calum. Calum didn't answer right away. He looked up at the ceiling of the truck, counted Shadow's breaths, then counted his own, and both were slowing down. He swallowed a mouthful of blood leaking inside his mouth. He said 2 words. Holloway. Dorchester. Raphael went silent for 2 seconds. He knew that address. He had personally built a file on the Holloway family in the 4th year, when Calum got drunk for the only time in 9 years and told him about a night of snowstorm, an 18-year-old girl, and a mother who hadn't taken the watch. That file had been in Calum's safe ever since, updated every 6 months, never once used. Are you sure, Calum? She's not one of us. She doesn't know who we are. That's exactly why. Raphael said nothing more. He turned the wheel south, across the Zakim Bridge, down the expressway, toward Dorchester. The dashboard clock read 9:42 when they passed the Ashmont sign. Calum had drifted into a half-conscious state in the back, and Shadow beside him had stopped making noise, only breathing, slow, then slower still. By the time the refrigerated truck turned onto the small street behind Dorchester Avenue, the clock read 2:03 in the morning. Raphael had circled 3 times to shake any tail. He stopped the truck 2 houses away from Holloway Veterinary Clinic, killed the lights, and shut off the engine. 2 other strays, following in an old Ford with no plates, were already standing at both ends of the street keeping watch. Raphael opened the rear doors, lifted Calum into his arms, and carried him across the damp October sleet. Shadow managed to stand on his own, even with both front legs trembling, even with blood still dripping 1 drop at a time onto the wet cement. And he followed the 2 men to the familiar front steps. Raphael pounded on the door 3 times with his elbow, because both hands were busy supporting his boss. The upstairs light came on after 12 seconds. There was the sound of hurried footsteps coming down the stairs. The door opened, and warm yellow light spilled across the wet snow like a warm blade, exactly like it had 9 years earlier, except this time Marlene wasn't there. Winter Holloway, 27 years old, wearing a gray flannel sweater, her hair still twisted up loosely even though it was now 2 in the morning, stood in the doorway for 1 silent second. She looked from Raphael's blood-covered face down to the man in his arms, then down to the huge black dog staggering at the foot of the steps, and time inside her stopped. She didn't need instinct. She didn't need judgment. She had remembered that face for 9 years, 3 months, and 21 days. She opened the door wider, stepped back to the side, and her voice was no louder than a breath. You're Calum. For the past 9 years, I've kept wondering whether you were still alive. Winter didn't let herself stop in that moment for more than a single breath. She had learned from her mother that memory saved no one. Only hands did. She turned, switched on the lights in the operating room, and began giving orders in a voice Raphael would later remember as the voice of a commander in a situation where there was no time left for kindness. Carry him to the main table. Put the dog on the second table. Wash your hands at the sink on the left. I don't need you completely sterile, only clean. Raphael obeyed without asking a single question. He laid Calum on the stainless steel table, cut the boss's shirt off with Winter's scissors, and under the white halogen lights, the bullet wound in his side and the deep wound in his thigh lay exposed. Shadow, despite having lost so much blood that the fur on his chest had clumped into stiff black patches, still managed to climb onto the second table by sheer final effort before collapsing onto the steel surface. Calum, half-conscious, lifted his head about half an inch and spoke the first 3 words he had said since entering the room. Shadow. First, operate on him. Winter was inserting an IV needle into the shallow vein in his left arm. She didn't look up. No, Winter. Do him first. I'm the doctor here, Mr. Bianchi. I decide the order. You're bleeding from the superficial femoral artery. If I leave you untreated for 3 more minutes, you'll die on my table, and your dog will still die after that. Shut your mouth. Raphael, standing at the foot of the table, holding a bag of transfusion blood, looked up. In 4 years of working for Calum Bianchi, he had never heard anyone, man or woman, speak to his boss in that tone, and he had never seen his boss keep quiet when he was given an order. But Calum kept quiet. He lowered his head back onto the table and closed his eyes. Winter pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 2 years. On the other end, after 4 rings, a sleepy male voice answered. Emmett, get up. I need you. Same old clinic address. 20 minutes. She heard blankets shifting on the other end, then the sound of shoes. Winter, are you okay? I'm okay. I've got an adult gunshot polytrauma case, and a large animal with penetrating chest wounds. I need a second set of hands for the human case. You don't ask the name. You don't call the police. If you can't get here in 20 minutes, then don't come at all. 2 seconds of silence. 18 minutes. Emmett Price arrived in 17 minutes. He was 31 years old, a trauma surgeon at Mass General, had loved Winter since their 3rd year at Tufts, and had lost her because Winter hadn't had time to love anyone since the day her mother died. He didn't ask questions. He only scrubbed in, pulled on gloves, and took his place across from Winter at the main table. For the next 6 hours, 2 operating tables ran side by side in a small room never designed for adult human surgery. Emmett repaired the wound to Calum's femoral artery, stitched torn muscle shredded by the spiraling bullet, and removed a deformed bullet fragment from the fatty tissue of his abdomen. Winter, at the second table, treated Shadow's lower body under local anesthesia, repaired the severed tendons and deep muscle tears in his left leg, and stabilized the heavy blood loss from the flank wound. She worked without speaking. She didn't take her hands off the dog for longer than 10 seconds to glance toward Calum. Each time she looked over, Emmett only gave a single small nod, meaning he was still alive. At 6:52 in the morning, Winter stitched the final suture across Shadow's chest, placed a pressure bandage over it, and pulled off her gloves. She sat down on the floor against the wall, her back to the medicine cabinet, and allowed herself to breathe out for the first time in 5 hours and 48 minutes. Emmett finished at the main table 10 minutes later, washed his hands, and said quietly, "They're both going to live. I wasn't here tonight, and you didn't see me." Winter nodded. Emmett walked out without turning back. The wall clock read 7:08. Calum woke at 9:15, his throat dry as paper, and the first thing he saw was Winter sitting beside him, wearing glasses, reading through a stack of files in her lap. She looked up when she saw him move. She didn't ask whether he was in pain. She didn't ask whether he remembered anything. She only set the papers aside. "Shadow is all right. You're all right. He lost 2 inches of his left lung, so he won't ever run fast again. You lost nearly 2 liters of blood. If Raphael had brought you here 10 minutes later, we'd be planning a funeral." Calum turned his head slightly. October sunlight was falling diagonally through the clinic window, and in that band of light, he saw the bottom drawer of the medical records cabinet. It was slightly open. Inside, beneath the yellowed papers, he saw a piece of metal reflecting the sun, and he knew at once what it was without Winter having to say a word. The Patek Philippe watch. 9 years. Untouched. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he did speak. "I know you owe $180,000. I know your brother needs surgery that costs $340,000. I know this clinic has 90 days left. I'll pay it all. Everything. Your brother's surgery in 14 days at a private cardiac center in Weston, with the doctor you choose. In return, you become my private doctor and Shadow's private doctor for 12 months. At my estate in Marblehead, you and your brother will be protected. You stop working 3 shifts a day. After 12 months, you're free to leave." Winter took off her glasses. She looked at him for a long time. "I don't do anything illegal. I don't hide evidence. I don't alter medical records. And I don't sign false names. I'm a doctor. I keep my license. I'm not asking for anything else. Rowan has surgery in 14 days. Not 15. Deal." She held out her hand. He took it. Her hand was cold. His hand was colder. Neither of them knew that in that moment, they had just signed a contract that would rewrite the rest of both their lives. 12 days after the handshake in the Dorchester clinic, Rowan Holloway was wheeled into the cardiac operating room at Weston Heart Center at 6:45 in the morning. The surgery lasted 7 hours and 10 minutes. The lead surgeon was Dr. Vaughn Sterling, the man at the top of a 3-year waiting list in New England. The man Winter had never even dared contact because his private consultation fee alone was $7,000. When Rowan was taken into recovery at 2 in the afternoon, his heart was beating normally for the first time in 14 years. Winter stood in the hallway, still clutching the strap of her handbag, and she cried for the first time in 4 months and 23 days, then for 4 days more. 3 weeks later, when Rowan was strong enough to walk, Winter packed her life into 4 cardboard boxes and 1 cloth bag. The house in Dorchester was locked up, not sold, not rented, only locked. Their father's debt had been paid off in full through a law firm whose name she didn't know. The notice of default had been withdrawn. The manager at Eastern Bank called 3 times to ask questions, and all 3 times Winter answered that she had an anonymous benefactor. The truck carrying the 2 siblings arrived in Marblehead on a Saturday afternoon near the end of October. The estate stood at the end of a private road on the northern coast. 3 acres of land, stainless steel gates, and a security system Raphael had designed himself. The house wasn't ostentatious. Gray granite, black slate roof, tall windows facing the Atlantic. Rowan stepped out of the truck, looked at the sea, then looked up at the house, and the 14-year-old boy who had just survived open-heart surgery couldn't say anything except 2 words. My God. Calum came out to meet them at the front door. He was wearing a gray cashmere sweater, no suit, no leather shoes, only an old pair of running shoes, and that was probably the first image of him Winter had ever seen that wasn't tied to blood or surgical fabric. He shook Rowan's hand, the way a man shakes another man's hand, not the hand of a child, and that was something the boy would remember forever. Shadow lay beside him on the porch, his front leg still bandaged, but those dark golden eyes found Winter at once, and didn't leave her for the first 10 minutes. Rowan learned to play chess with Calum in the first week. He lost 12 games in a row. On the 13th game, Calum deliberately made 1 wrong move, and Rowan won, and Rowan knew he had done it on purpose, and neither of them said it aloud. That was how men in this house loved one another. As for Shadow, even though the entire estate had been his territory for 9 years, he chose Winter on the very first night. He slept beneath her bed. He followed her from the bathroom to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the library. When she sat stitching, the wounds still left on his body, he didn't flinch. When she cried for the second time in her life, on the 9th night in Marblehead, for a reason she told no one, Shadow laid his head in her lap and didn't move until she stopped. On the 12th night, Raphael brought home a man who had been shot in the left shoulder. His name was Dante Russo, a stray who had worked for Calum for 4 years, 41 years old, just hit during an asset recovery in Lowell. The bullet had gone through and hadn't remained in the body, but the wound had been crudely stitched with nylon thread in the car and needed to be treated again. Raphael was about to take him down to the basement, where Calum had installed a small medical room 3 years earlier. Winter happened to be walking down the corridor then, holding a cup of tea, and she stopped. She looked at the blood on Dante's coat, then at Raphael. She didn't ask a question. She only said 1 sentence. Take him down to the medical room. I'll get my things. 2 hours later, Winter packed away the instruments, removed her gloves, and walked up the main staircase. She had changed into a clean sweater. She didn't go straight to her room. She went to Calum's study on the 2nd floor, knocked once, and opened the door without waiting for him to invite her in. Calum was sitting at the desk, no documents in front of him, only an empty glass of whiskey and a phone lying face down. He looked up. Shadow was stretched out on the rug at his feet. Winter closed the door behind her, stood still in the middle of the room, and looked straight into his eyes. I just stitched 5 stitches into the shoulder of a man who was shot inside your house, and I don't even know his last name. I didn't ask. I won't ask. I don't care. But this is what I do care about. Don't lie to me, Calum. I can handle the truth. I can't handle a lie. If one day I find out you've lied to me, even once, this 12-month arrangement ends that very day. Calum looked at her for a long time. Then he stood, went to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 glasses of 18-year-old Macallan, handed one to her, and sat down in the leather chair facing the desk, instead of returning to his own seat, then motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him. She sat. He told her. Not everything. Not about Tommaso. Not about Gio. Not about the night on Beacon Hill. But he told her about his mother, about Isabella Bianchi, and about the final 6 months of her life, and about the way she had grown thin, the way her wedding ring slipped from her hand, the way she had held his hand on the last night and spoken 3 words he had never repeated to anyone. He told her about the belief that had grown inside him for 15 years since then, that she hadn't died of natural heart failure, that someone in the Beacon Hill house had done it to her, and that he had never had proof. When he finished speaking, his glass of Macallan was untouched. Winter set her own glass down gently on the desk. She looked at him for a very long time before asking, "Are you sure your mother was killed, Calum?" He was silent. It was the question no one in 9 years had dared ask him to his face, because no one in 9 years had been brave enough or close enough to ask it. And when he couldn't answer, Winter stood, walked to the desk, and placed her hand over the back of his hand for 3 seconds, no more, then left the room. The next morning, Calum set a cardboard box down on the desk in the library and said 3 words to Winter. "My mother's medical records." Inside the box were 12 sets of medical files, more than 800 pages in total, their edges yellowed from 24 years inside a private lawyer's safe in Back Bay. Calum had kept them since he was 20, when he first began to wonder why his mother had died so quickly. In the 15 years since then, he had read them over and over, searching for something he didn't have the medical knowledge to see. Winter sat down with black coffee and read. For 3 straight days. She took 2 days off from the emergency center at Angel Memorial, something she hadn't done once in 4 years. She read every page with the eyes of someone who had looked through thousands of medical records, even if they had belonged to dogs and cats, and that had been enough to train her to see what wasn't present on the page, rather than only what was. On the 3rd night, at 11:48, she called Calum into the library. He came in wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. She spread 7 pages across the oak table and placed her finger on each place she had marked in red pencil. 3 things don't add up. First, in the final 6 months, your mother's chart shows 19 visits, but there are only 14 invoices. 5 are missing. Second, 9 of those 19 visits record symptoms of progressive congestive heart failure, but there isn't a single electrocardiogram in the file. Not one. A heart failure patient without an ECG over 6 months, Calum. That doesn't happen in American medicine, not even 30 years ago. Third, and this is the most important part, all 7 of the final prescriptions in this file were signed by a doctor named Dr. H. Mercer. I checked the American Medical Association directory, and I checked the licensing systems in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Vermont. There was no doctor named H. Mercer practicing internal medicine anywhere in New England during that period. That name doesn't exist. Calum read through the 7 pages one by one, his finger touching each signature as if trying to remember a name that wasn't his own. He stood still for 2 minutes. Then he called Raphael. Raphael arrived in 5 minutes. He listened as Winter laid out the 3 points again, then nodded once. That means a real doctor signed these prescriptions, but not under a real name. Someone familiar with the house, someone who could come to the mansion for private visits, without going through any hospital. I'll find them. He spent 2 days cross-referencing old Bianchi estate payroll records and private security logs from the late 90s to find any medical professional who had made unrecorded house calls. 4 days later, Raphael returned from a trip whose route he told no one except Calum. He brought back a name. Dr. Beatrice Klein, 72 years old. She was private internal medicine physician to the Bianchi family for 15 years, from 1988 to 2003. After Isabella died, she took early retirement and moved to Wellfleet on Cape Cod, where she lives alone in a wooden house 2 miles off the main road. No landline, no social media. I found her through the state's property tax records. I went there. She shut the door when she saw my old Marine badge. She doesn't open her door to armed men anymore. Through the crack in the door, she said only one thing. If you want to talk, send a woman. No weapons, no recording. Calum turned to Winter. He didn't need to ask. She had already nodded before he opened his mouth. 2 days later, Winter drove the estate's Volvo XC90 south on Route 6 by herself, across the Sagamore Bridge, deep into Cape Cod and into the village of Wellfleet, a fishing town already asleep after the summer season. Beatrice Klein's wooden house stood a 1/4 mile from the sea, painted a weathered salt gray, with a hydrangea garden surrounding the front porch, just entering the last bloom of October. Winter parked 200 meters from the house and walked to the door, carrying nothing except a cloth bag with country pastries she had bought from a bakery in town. The door opened after 2 knocks. Beatrice Klein was half a head shorter than Winter, with short silver hair, pale blue eyes, and a hand-knit sea blue sweater. She said nothing. She only looked Winter up and down, then stepped back and left the door open. "Do you drink tea or coffee?" "Tea, if you have it." For the first 3 hours, the 2 women sat on the back porch overlooking the hydrangea garden and didn't say a single word about Isabella, about Tommaso, or about the medical records. They talked about flowers, about why blue hydrangeas turned pink when the soil pH changed, about why that plant could survive sea wind but not the noon sun. Winter spoke about the small garden behind the Dorchester Clinic where her mother had planted 7 hydrangea bushes and died before the last one had ever flowered. Beatrice Klein listened. In the 3rd hour, after both women had emptied 2 cups of tea and the afternoon light had turned golden across the petals, Beatrice set her cup down and spoke in the calm voice of someone who had been waiting 24 years to say this sentence. "Isabella Bianchi didn't die of natural heart failure, Miss Holloway. She was given low-dose digitalis, mixed into her daily blood pressure medicine, throughout the last 6 months, enough to imitate congestive heart failure, enough to kill an adult woman weighing 53 kilograms in 200 days. I signed the last 7 prescriptions under the name Dr. H. Mercer, for one reason. Tommaso Bianchi was holding my daughter, Nora Klein, who was 19 at the time and a second-year student at Smith College, as collateral. No one could see the chains, but I knew exactly where they were on her. I signed to keep Nora alive. Nora lived. She died 3 years ago in a car accident in Vermont, unrelated to any of this. From the day my daughter died, I have been waiting for a day when someone like you would knock on my door. And there's one more thing, Miss Holloway. Something even the man who sent you here doesn't know. Calum Bianchi isn't Tommaso's biological son." Winter didn't let Beatrice Klein's final sentence fall into silence for longer than a single breath. She had learned in the operating room that when a patient opened their mouth to speak a truth they had kept buried for 24 years, the only thing anyone should do was remain quiet long enough for them to finish. She set her teacup down and waited. Beatrice Klein looked out at the hydrangea garden for a while, then began to speak, her voice unchanged, as though she were reading aloud from an old medical chart. 36 years ago, in November of 1989, the 2 Bianchi brothers went deer hunting in the Killington Mountains of Vermont. Just the 2 of them. No guide, no staff, and that was the first strange thing. Fausto Bianchi was the older brother, Thame 3, Don of the family, the man who had married Isabella Romano 1 year earlier, and at that time Isabella was 5 months pregnant with their first child. Tommaso Bianchi was the younger brother, 29, unmarried, without any formal rank in the family, living in his brother's shadow since the day he was born. On the second night of the trip, an unusually heavy snowstorm came in, heavy enough that the local radio issued a level 3 warning. The next morning, Tommaso walked down the mountain alone, 3 or 4 miles to the Killington police station, and reported that Fausto had gone hunting early in the fog and never returned to camp. They searched for 4 weeks. Not a single fragment of bone was ever found. The official report listed him as missing due to an accident, likely having fallen into a ravine and been buried by snow. 3 months later, Tommaso Bianchi married Isabella. That year she was 26, 8 months pregnant, and had no family in America to return to. Winter didn't ask anything. She knew when a story wasn't finished yet. Beatrice stood, went inside the house, and returned 3 minutes later with a small chestnut wood box about the size of a book. She set it down on the table between them. "Isabella gave me this box on the 80th night before she died. By then I already suspected what was happening, but I was still signing the prescriptions that were killing her because of Nora. She didn't blame me. She said only one thing: if one day my son comes to you, give him this. If he never comes, burn it. I waited 24 years. I didn't burn it." She pushed the box across the table toward Winter. "Give it to Calum. I don't need to read any of it again. I've already read it." Winter returned to Marblehead at 11 that same night. The chestnut wood box sat on the passenger seat, tied with a black silk ribbon that had browned with age. Calum was waiting in the library, not reading, not drinking, only sitting there. Shadow lay at his feet. Winter placed the box on the table, sat down across from him, and said one sentence: "I'm going outside. You should read it alone." She had reached the door when he called after her. "Stay. I can't read it alone." She sat back down. He opened the box. Inside were 3 things. A lock of a man's dark hair, neatly coiled in a piece of tissue paper, labeled in handwriting, Fausto Romano Bianchi, 1989. A stack of black and white photographs, 11 in all, showing a dark-haired man holding a pregnant woman in a garden. And in that man's eyes, Calum saw himself for the first time in his life. And a letter, written in handwriting Calum recognized from the birthday cards of his childhood. 3 sheets of paper, written on both sides. Calum unfolded the letter. He read. Winter didn't read along. She watched his face change with every paragraph, every sentence. The letter wasn't very long. Isabella Bianchi had written it when she knew she was about to die, and she wrote in the voice of a woman who had run out of time to speak gently. She told him that in the 3rd month after the forced marriage, on a drunken night in the Beacon Hill mansion, Tommaso had confessed to her that during the Killington snowstorm, he had stabbed his brother in the back with a hunting knife, pushed the body into a ravine, and then walked down to the police station in his own boots. She told him that from that night on, she had known she was living with the man who had killed the father of the child inside her. She had not run because she knew that if Tommaso could kill one Bianchi, he wouldn't hesitate to kill one more woman and one more baby. She stayed so Calum could be born. She stayed for 12 more years so Calum could have a mother. And when Tommaso began feeding her digitalis, she knew why, but she no longer had the strength to run. In the final line of the letter, written in a trembling hand, Isabella had written a sentence that Calum read 3 times in a row before he understood it. "You aren't the son of the man who killed. You're the son of Fausto Bianchi, the man who dared to love me. The blood in you is the blood of someone who dared to love, not someone who dared to kill. Don't become them." Calum set the letter down on the table. He didn't cry. He only sat there, unmoving, eyes unblinking, staring at a point on the opposite wall where there was nothing. 2 hours passed. The clock on the mantel struck 12, then 1. Winter didn't stand up, didn't leave, didn't speak. Shadow at his feet lifted his head 3 times, then lay back down again. When the clock struck 1:30 in the morning, Calum turned his head toward Winter. His eyes were dry. His mouth didn't open. But Winter saw that something inside him had broken and was trying to piece itself back together. And she didn't know what she still had left to give him except one hand. She stood, walked around the table, sat down beside him on the leather chair, and placed her hand over his, palm against the back of his hand, for 3 seconds, then 5. Calum turned to look at her. He said nothing. She said nothing. He leaned toward her slowly, like a man afraid of breaking glass, and his lips touched hers in a kiss that wasn't the kiss of a man kissing a woman, but the kiss of one broken soul kissing another broken soul, 2 shattered pieces, finding each other in the dark, not out of desire, but because neither of them had the strength left to stand alone anymore. When they drew apart, neither of them spoke. Shadow rested his head on Calum's leg, and the 3 living creatures in that room listened to the clock strike 2:30 in the morning together. 3 days after the night of reading the letter, Calum summoned the strays to the basement of the Marblehead estate at 6 in the evening. 14 men and 4 women, the inner circle of the inner circle, sat around a long oak table that Calum had bought from a dissolved Italian monastery in Lynn 2 years earlier. Raphael sat at his right, Silas Donovan at his left, Marin Volkov at the end of the table, her laptop open. Ahmed Kasanov stood leaning against the wall, because he never sat. Calum spoke for 23 minutes. He left out not a single detail. About Killington, about Digitalis, about Nora Klein, about the 24-year-old letter, the lock of hair, the stack of black and white photographs. When he finished, no one in the room spoke. Raphael placed both hands on the table, palms down, and that was how he kept the anger of a former Marine under control. Calum laid out the plan. Not to kill Tommaso, not a war within the family, to expose him before the New England Commission, the council of the 5 families that governed the Italian-American underworld from Portland to Hartford, where the old ancestral laws still held force, and where a Don who murdered his own brother to steal the throne and slowly killed his brother's wife would never survive more than 48 hours once the truth was confirmed. To expose him, Calum needed 3 things: Isabella's handwritten letter, already in hand, a video testimony from Beatrice Klein in the presence of an independent lawyer, which Klein had agreed to after Winter called her from Wellfleet that morning, And the third thing, the most important of all, was DNA evidence establishing paternity between Calum and Fausto Bianchi. Beatrice Klein, inside the chestnut box, had included 13 strands of hair she had secretly secured from Fausto's personal grooming kit shortly after his disappearance in Killington, preserved in a sealed envelope for 36 years. Marin had sent the sample that morning to Orchid Genomics, a private forensic laboratory in Austin, using the name of a shell law firm. The results were expected in 6 days. While they waited, the strays divided into 3 teams. One team protected the outer perimeter of the Marblehead estate. One team watched Beacon Hill and Gio's house in Back Bay. The third team, under Silas, prepared the legal file to be sent to Don Aurelio Castellano, current chairman of the commission, with a formal request for an emergency tribunal. Calum ended the meeting at 8:45 with one short sentence. No one goes looking for Tommaso. He has to come to the tribunal on his own, believing he will win. But at another mansion in Back Bay, Giovanni Bianchi didn't need proof to know. Over the past 3 weeks, his men had reported 3 trips by Rafael Moreno to Cape Cod, 1 trip by Winter Holloway to Wellfleet and back with a small box on the passenger seat, and 3 genetic testing orders placed through a law firm Calum had never used before. Gio was 32, not as intelligent as the man his brother had believed was their father, but intelligent enough to know when a trap was being built for his father, and when there was no time left to wait. He didn't call Tommaso. He called 4 men he had been quietly paying for 2 years. Not Calum's strays, not Tommaso's Bianchis, only freelance mercenaries who worked for his money. On Friday morning, the 10th day after the letter, Rowan Holloway had a follow-up heart appointment at Tufts Medical Center, 3 weeks after surgery, for a valve and rhythm check. Winter couldn't go. She had an emergency case at Angel at that hour. Calum sent Dante Russo, the stray whose wound she had stitched in the basement medical room the night before. Dante drove Rowan in an armored Suburban, parked on the 3rd level of the hospital garage at 10:15, and went up with the boy to cardiology. The appointment ended at 11:40. When Dante and Rowan stepped out of the elevator to return to the 3rd level of the garage, Dante caught the smell of Camel cigarettes in that closed air, half a second too late. He pulled Rowan to the ground just as the first bullet tore through his throat. He fell. He still had time to draw his Glock and fire 3 shots, hitting 1 man, before the second bullet went through his temple. Dante Russo, 41 years old, father of 2 daughters aged 9 and 11 in Revere, died face down on the concrete of the 3rd-floor parking garage at Tufts Medical Center, one hand still trying to pull Rowan toward him. Rowan was dragged into a black van by 2 masked men. The doors slammed shut. The van sped down the 3 levels, passed through a security checkpoint they had bought 3 months earlier, and vanished into Boston's midday traffic. Calum received the video at 12:23. It came by encrypted message to his private phone, with no sender. 37 seconds. Rowan, tied to a wooden chair, tape over his mouth, still wearing his hospital jacket. The boy wasn't crying. His eyes were wide open, looking straight into the camera, and in that moment Calum saw himself at 12 years old. Gio's voice came from off-screen, hoarse, smooth, almost intimate. "Trade your life for the kids, brother. Alone, no dog, no gun. Warehouse number 7, Chelsea Docks. Midnight. If you call anyone else. If I see one car that isn't yours. If I see a shadow bigger than 1 man. The boy comes home in 4 pieces." The video ended. Calum set the phone down on the oak table. He didn't breathe for 4 seconds. When he looked up, Winter was already standing in the doorway of the library. She hadn't heard the video. She had only seen his face. And for someone raised in emergency rooms, that was enough information. She stepped inside, shut the door behind her, and walked straight to the desk. Calum played the video again for her. She watched all 37 seconds. When it ended, she didn't sit down. She didn't cry. She placed both hands on the desk, drew one short breath, and spoke in a voice he had never heard from her before. "Go save him. Go now. Don't think about me. Don't think about Shadow. Don't think about your plan with the commission. Go bring my brother back." Calum stood. He came around the desk, stopped half a step from her, and said quietly, "I won't go alone, but I will bring him back." She gave one small nod. He stepped out the door. Shadow was already standing in the hallway before Calum called his name, the fur along his spine raised, those dark golden eyes already knowing everything they needed to know. Warehouse number 7 at Chelsea Docks was an abandoned 3-story steel structure with a shattered tin roof, no lights, standing exactly 1.5 miles east of Calem's Bianchi Imports along the waterfront. Gio had chosen the location with a message. You started at this port making $12 an hour, and you will end at this port too. Calem arrived at 11:54 in a black Range Rover, alone at the wheel, with no body armor, no earpiece, no phone. His 2 guns had been left in the estate safe in front of Raphael, because Calem knew Gio's men would sweep him with a metal detector from 10 meters outside the door. Shadow sat in the passenger seat. Calem had ordered the dog to stay at Marblehead 3 times, and each time Shadow had only looked at him without moving, and by the 4th time Calem had silently opened the car door. There are roads a man can't walk without his shadow. When he stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the large sliding warehouse door, Shadow followed 3 paces behind him, with the slight limp in his back leg from the old knife wound, but his head was high, and his dark golden eyes flashed beneath the weak neon lights of the pier. The steel door opened when he was 3 meters away. 2 masked men stood on either side. They didn't sweep him with a detector. They had been told Calem would come exactly as agreed, and they were right. He walked in. The inside of the warehouse was lit by 6 industrial lamps, swaying from 3 main steel beams running across the ceiling. In the middle of the concrete floor, Rowan Holloway sat on a wooden chair, both hands and both feet bound with plastic ties, the tape still across his mouth. The boy was trembling, but he wasn't crying. Gio stood 4 steps away from Rowan, an unlit cigar in his left hand, his right hand resting on the grip of the cig at his waist. Around him, 7 more gunmen stood in a half circle, 3 behind Rowan, 2 at the flanks, 2 near the entrance, 8 in total. Calem stopped 10 meters from Gio. Shadow stopped on his right. Half a step back, Gio looked at Shadow, then at Calem, and smiled with half his mouth. Exactly the same smile he had worn in the Beacon Hill wine cellar 9 years earlier. I said no dog, brother, but fine, because tonight is family night. He didn't know that Rafael Moreno, Ahmed Kasanov, Marin Volkov, and 3 other strays had taken positions on the 3 steel beams since 3 that afternoon, before Gio's men swept the area. They had lain still in the darkness of the upper structure, breathing softly, not moving, with 6 thermal binoculars and 4 compact sniper rifles. Raphael had disobeyed Calem, and it was the only time in 5 years he had disobeyed, and both men had known that before Calem drove away from the estate. Gio took 2 steps toward Rowan and placed his right hand on the boy's head. Make the trade, brother. You kneel, I let him go. Calem didn't kneel. He looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at him, and in the gray-blue eyes that matched his sister's, Calem read not fear, but something else. Something the boy had learned in 4 weeks at the Marblehead estate, and he was signaling it to him. I'm okay. Do your job. Calem drew 1 breath. He said 1 single sentence into the tiny Bluetooth receiver, hidden inside the rim of his right ear. The receiver Marin had fitted that morning, and no one at the port had detected. Now. The lights in the warehouse went out at the same time. It wasn't a power failure. Ahmed had fired 4 suppressed shots into the 4 main electrical lines from the steel beam above. In the first 3 seconds of absolute darkness, the thermal sights above locked onto their targets, and the gunfire began from above, not from below. The 2 gunmen at the entrance went down before they could draw. 1 man standing behind Rowan collapsed with a bullet through the shoulder fired from a 45-degree angle above. Gio roared, yanked out his cig, and fired wildly into the darkness near the ceiling. At that exact moment, Shadow lunged. The dog crossed 10 meters of concrete in only 3 long strides, and when he hit, 150 pounds of flesh and bone slammed into Gio's chest like a sledgehammer. The cig jerked off 1 last shot, the bullet grazing through Shadow's right shoulder and punching into the dog's chest. But Shadow's jaws had already clamped around Gio's right wrist and ground down to the bone, pinning him to the floor while the dog's blood dripped onto the man's face. The cig fell 1/2 meter from both their hands. Calem reached them in 3 strides. He picked up the gun, aimed it at the center of Gio's forehead, and at that moment, the emergency lights overhead flared on again, pouring straight down over 2 brothers of the same family name and not the same blood. Gio lay there, his right hand no longer really a hand, his blood and Shadow's blood mixed together across the white chest of his shirt. He was shaking. Not from pain, from fear. You're not Tommaso, Calem. You're not him. Calem pressed the muzzle of the cig another 1/2 inch into the skin of Gio's forehead. No, Gio, I'm not. And that's the only reason I'm not killing you tonight. He reversed the gun, and struck Gio once in the temple with the steel grip, hard and final. Gio went unconscious. Raphael and Ahmed jumped down from the steel beams then, guns still raised, and cleared the remaining 3 shooters in 6 seconds. Not one man on Gio's side got off another shot. Calum let the cig drop to the floor, walked to the wooden chair, cut the plastic ties binding Rowan with Raphael's folding knife, and peeled the tape from the boy's mouth as gently as he knew how. Rowan couldn't say a word. He only threw his whole body into Calum, his 14-year-old arms wrapping tightly around the neck of the man who had taught him chess for 4 weeks, and he cried into the white shirt that smelled of gunpowder and sweat. Calum caught the boy in both arms, lowered his head against Rowan's hair, and that was when he cried for the first time in 9 years, without a sound. Only 2 lines of salt water running down his cheeks that no one saw, except the sister who was running into the warehouse through the back door, carrying a medical kit and a flashlight. Winter had followed Raphael's team, against Calum's orders, and when she saw Shadow lying on the concrete floor, 3 steps from Gio, with another man's blood still at his mouth and his own blood pouring from his chest, she set down the kit, switched on the flashlight, and dropped to her knees. She operated on Shadow right there, on the concrete floor of warehouse number 7 at Chelsea Docks, under the flashlight Raphael held, for 40 minutes. The bullet had gone through the right lung and lodged in a rib. She removed the bullet. She stitched the pleural lining. She stopped the bleeding. When she placed the final stitch, Shadow opened his eyes, licked her wrist once, and let out one long breath. Winter spoke into the dog's ear in the hoarse voice her mother had once used with dying animals. "You're going to live, but you'll never run the way you used to again, old friend." 3 days after the night at warehouse number 7, the New England Commission convened the tribunal at the private estate of Don Aurelio Castellano in Newport, Rhode Island, a 3-story limestone house overlooking Narragansett Bay, kept by the Castellano family for meetings of this kind since 1972. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November, the sea gray as steel, the wind from the Atlantic hissing past the tall windows of the council chamber on the 2nd floor. 5 Dons sat at an oval walnut table, each with one advisor standing behind him, and no one carried a gun into the room. Aurelio Castellano presided, 74 years old, silver hair brushed back, black eyes still as sharp as they had been when he was 30. The other 4 Dons were Don Vittorio Messina of the Messina family in Providence, Don Enzo Morelli of Morelli, Hartford, Don Niccolo Pagano of the Pagano family in Portland, Maine, and Don Marco Fontana of the Fontana family in Springfield. Tommaso Bianchi arrived at 9:46, 7 minutes ahead of schedule, wearing a dark navy 3-piece suit, a red carnation pinned to his left breast, and the smile of a man who believed this morning's session was nothing more than diplomatic coffee. He entered the room alone, with only one old advisor left standing in the hallway. Calum arrived at 10 exactly, through the opposite door. He wore a black 3-piece suit, no flower, no tie, only a white shirt and a waistcoat. Shadow did not come with him. Shadow was lying on a padded bed in the Marblehead Library, with Winter beside him, because the dog still wasn't strong enough to travel that far only 3 days after surgery on the warehouse floor. Raphael walked behind Calum and stopped at the door, as the rules required. When Calum stepped inside, Tommaso looked up, and for the first time in 9 years, the 2 men who carried the same surname looked at each other across the same room. Tommaso didn't rise. He didn't nod. He only set his espresso cup down on its porcelain saucer with a soft click, and his lips thinned. Aurelio Castellano opened the tribunal with a sentence in old, formal Italian, then switched to English. Calum Bianchi has requested this tribunal with 3 charges against Tommaso Bianchi: the murder of his elder brother, Fausto Bianchi, in Killington, Vermont, in 1989, the killing of Isabella Bianchi, Fausto's wife, through low-dose digitalis over 6 months in the year 2000, and the theft of the Don seat of the Bianchi family under a false claim for 36 years. Calum, present your evidence. Calum placed 3 things on the oval table. Isabella's handwritten letter, 3 pages, sealed in archival plastic. A tablet already open to the recorded testimony of Beatrice Klein, 93 minutes long, certified by independent attorney Harold Whitman of Boston, and an envelope from Orchid Genomics in Austin, sealed and unopened. Calum opened the envelope in front of the commission. He read one line aloud. Paternity comparison result. Sample A, hair from Calum Bianchi. Sample B, hair from Fausto Romano Bianchi, collected in 1989. Probability of father-son relationship, 99.97%. Probability of father-son relationship between Tommaso Bianchi and Calum Bianchi, below 0.3%. He set the paper down on the table. Silence lasted 7 seconds. Aurelio passed the paper to Vittorio. Vittorio passed it to Enzo. Enzo passed it to Niccolo. Niccolo passed it to Marco. Each man read it, and each man said nothing. When the page returned to Aurelio, he nodded toward Calum. Continue. Calum pressed play on the video. 93 minutes later, when Beatrice Klein finished her final testimony from the wooden house in Wellfleet, Tommaso's complexion had gone a shade paler. Both his hands rested on his knees. He was no longer holding the espresso cup. Aurelio read Isabella's letter aloud, line by line for the whole council to hear. When he reached the final sentence, "You are the son of Fausto Bianchi, the man who dared to love your mother. The blood in you is the blood of one who dared to love, not one who dared to kill." Tommaso Bianchi shot up from his chair. The leather chair toppled backward and struck the wooden floor with a loud crack. He pointed a trembling finger straight at Calum, that finger exactly the same as the one he had pointed in the Beacon Hill wine cellar 9 years earlier, and his voice broke into a scream. Aurelio Castellano said later he had never heard from a Don in 40 years of work. "That boy isn't my son. He's a traitor. Throw him out. Throw him out of this room the way I threw him out of my house 9 years ago." The entire room fell silent. Calum didn't move. He stood where he was, both hands at his sides, looking at Tommaso with those steel-gray eyes. And on his face, Aurelio Castellano would later say, he didn't see hatred. He saw something heavier, a rage that had grown old enough to turn into pity. Calum spoke in a calm voice, not loud, not shaking, clear enough for all 5 Dons to hear. "You're right, Tommaso. I'm not your son. I'm the son of the man you stabbed in the back with a hunting knife in the Killington woods, the man whose body you pushed into a ravine, the man whose wife you stole, whose name you stole, whose throne you stole, whose son's blood you stole for 36 years. I'm not here to claim the name Bianchi from you. I'm here to give it back to the man who gave it to me." Tommaso was still standing, his finger still raised, but it was no longer trembling. It had frozen in the air, because in Calum's eyes he had seen that he no longer had a single answer left. Aurelio Castellano rose to his feet. "The commission will vote. By tradition, the vote is by raised hand, in the open, with no abstentions." He looked at the other 4 Dons. Messina raised his hand first. Morelli raised his after 3 seconds. Pagano raised his next. Fontana did not raise his hand. He bowed his head and closed his eyes. Aurelio raised his own hand last. 4 out of 5. Aurelio turned to Tommaso. His voice was still slow, still gentle, but there was no room left in it for negotiation. "Tommaso Bianchi, the commission finds you guilty on all 3 charges. Under the ancestral law of the New England families, you are granted 48 hours of honor from this hour, 11:39 this morning, to end your own life in your private residence, by whatever method you choose. After 48 hours, if you're still breathing, the commission will send men. No negotiation, no appeal. You may go home." Tommaso said nothing. He stood still for 3 seconds, looked at Calum one final time, then walked out of the room on unsteady steps. The door closed behind him. Aurelio Castellano turned to Calum. He walked around the oval table, stopped half a step away, and placed a hand on his shoulder the way an old man places a hand on the shoulder of a younger man who has proven something important. "The Don seat of the Bianchi family is yours from this moment, Calum, if you want it. Fausto would be proud, but I know you've already built an empire of your own. What do you want? Say it, and the commission will stand behind you." Calum accepted the title of Don Bianchi before the commission that morning, not because he wanted the seat, but because he knew it was the only way to bring to a proper end what Tommaso had begun. 43 hours after the Newport tribunal, Tommaso Bianchi was found by his longtime housekeeper in the library of the Beacon Hill mansion, seated in his brother's old leather armchair, wearing the same dark navy suit he had worn to the commission meeting, and he had chosen his final method with a 19th-century pistol. Fausto had left in the safe 36 years earlier. The Boston Globe the next day reported the death in 3 words: "Stroke at home," because that was the version the commission had agreed would go into the public record. The funeral took place 3 days later at St. Stephen Catholic Church in the North End. Calum didn't attend. He sent a wreath with no sender's name. Giovanni Bianchi flew to Palermo 48 hours after the warehouse night. With 2 fingers missing from his right hand, because Shadow's bite had not been treated in time in the hours after he lost consciousness, and he would never set foot on American soil again. The commission made sure of that. The next 6 months at the Marblehead estate passed slowly in a rhythm Calum had never known before. He didn't dismantle the Bianchi empire, because that would have created a power vacuum the other 3 families would have fought over in blood. He transformed it. Chelsea Harbor and Bianchi imports were moved entirely into legitimate business, importing Italian wine and olive oil under federal licenses, with taxes fully paid. 3 underground warehouses in Somerville were shut down overnight. 14 loan shark operations were dissolved, their debts bought out by Calum with his own money and erased completely for those debtors who had families. 2 private casinos in Everett were sold to an operator licensed by the state of Massachusetts. Silas Donovan led a legal team that worked 6 days a week through that entire transition. What Calum did with his own hands, delegating it to no one, was find the list of 23 families. 23 families Tommaso and his men had harmed over the course of 36 years. People forced to sell their homes, falsely accused, stripped of husbands or fathers in staged killings, beaten, and never able to report it. Marin Volkov built the list from the family's underground accounting records. Calum met each family one by one, sat in their living rooms, drank their coffee, and he didn't apologize because he knew an apology wouldn't repair anything. He only handed over a thick envelope and a legal document confirming that the money wasn't a bribe, carried no conditions, and demanded no silence. The total transferred to the 23 families was $11.6 million. Rafael Moreno opened an Italian restaurant called Moreno's in the South End in the 5th month. 1 floor, 32 seats, with a menu his wife wrote out by hand every morning. He was still Calum's right hand in every real sense, but on paper he was a restaurant owner, and Rafael had begun sleeping 8 hours a night for the first time in 16 years. Winter opened Isabella's veterinary hospital on the same street as her mother's old Dorchester clinic in the 6th month. 3 floors, 11 employees, a modern operating room, and an intensive care wing for large animals. The lower 2 floors ran at market rates to cover the staff's salaries. The 3rd floor was reserved for families with no insurance, free examinations, free surgeries, no papers required. She hung the only black and white photograph of Marlene Holloway in the front hall, along with a smaller photograph of a dark-haired woman in a winter cashmere coat, and no one on the staff knew who she was, and Winter never explained. Rowan Holloway turned 15 that spring, returned to Boston Latin after 6 months away recovering, ranked first in his class in biology, and wrote in his term essay that he wanted to become a pediatric cardiac surgeon so he could save children like himself before their families had to sell everything. Calum read that essay at the breakfast table. He didn't say a word. He only pushed the plate of toast toward the boy and poured him more orange juice. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon at the end of May in the backyard of the Marblehead estate, where the blue hydrangeas Winter had planted 2 months earlier had just begun their first bloom. 15 guests. Rowan stood beside his sister, holding the rings in a small velvet box that he himself had engraved with both their names on the inside, using the school's laser engraver. Raphael stood as witness for Calum. Beatrice Klein sat in the front row wearing a wide-brimmed white straw hat and cried quietly throughout the ceremony, and no one tried to wipe the tears from her face. 12 other strays stood in 2 rows along either side of the aisle, dressed in dark suits, and for the first time in many years none of them wore a gun beneath the jacket. Shadow, now 10 years old, limping on 3 good legs because his right shoulder was still weak from the warehouse bullet, wore a black bow tie Rowan had carefully fastened around the dog's neck that morning, and he walked beside Winter down the aisle in place of the father who wasn't there. When Calum and Winter spoke their vows, Shadow sat down between them, back straight, head lifted, those dark golden eyes fixed on the far Atlantic, and he remained there through the entire ceremony, like a 16th witness. No one in that yard dared speak aloud. 1 year passed after the wedding, and Shadow turned 11 that autumn, an age not many Neapolitan mastiffs ever reached, and for Shadow it had become a prolonged mercy granted by fate. The dog no longer followed Calum down the stairs each morning. He chose instead to lie on the thick rug in front of the granite fireplace in the main sitting room, where the morning sun from the east-facing windows fell at exactly 9 o'clock, and he would lift his head when Calum walked by, look at him with those dark, golden eyes that had grown a little clouded, then lower his head again. Winter examined him once a week through that entire month. She didn't say anything to Calum. He didn't ask. Both of them knew. At the end of February, the snowstorm returned to Boston. It wasn't the kind of historic storm that came once in 70 years, only an ordinary heavy snow night in New England. But it arrived exactly 10 years after the first storm. Caleb sat beside Shadow by the fireplace from 8 that evening on. Winter went upstairs at 11. She understood that there were moments when a man needed to remain alone with the only shadow that had never left him. The fire burned slowly in the hearth. The snow beyond the windows fell more quietly than it had on the Beacon Hill night, with no roaring wind, only flakes settling onto the ledge in layer after layer, as though the night itself knew it was standing guard for someone. Shadow breathed slowly. Each breath came out as a smaller cloud than the one before, exactly like the night in the wine cellar 10 years earlier, except this time the dog had no arrow in his shoulder, no blood clotting beneath his feet, no one ordering anyone to shoot anyone anymore. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, resting one hand against Shadow's side, and he could feel the dog's heart beating beneath the black fur that had gone gray around the muzzle. He spoke to him in the hoarse voice no one else had heard in 9 years. "You've taken me far enough, old friend. You don't have to wait for me anymore. Go, if you want to go." Shadow opened his eyes and looked at him one last time. Those dark golden eyes, for the first time in 10 years, no longer held iron will. There was only the peace of a creature that had finished its work. He lifted his head about half an inch, enough to lick Caleb's wrist once, that rough tongue brushing lightly across the tendons of the man who had carried him through 4 miles of snow before he even had a name. And then he lowered his head, and he let out his final breath. Caleb sat beside the fireplace until dawn, without moving, his hand still resting on the silent side. When Winter came downstairs at 6:15, she said nothing. She only sat beside her husband, rested her head on his shoulder, and the two of them watched the fire until the sun rose. They buried Shadow on the high hill behind the estate, the hill that looked straight east over the Atlantic, where the sea wind blew hardest in November, and where the sun rose first over Marblehead. Caleb dug the grave himself with his bare hands, allowing no one to help, for 2 hours, and when he laid Shadow beneath the damp earth and stone, he wrapped the dog in the fireside rug he had slept on during the final 4 years of his life. Rowan, 16 then, stood beside his sister at a respectful distance. Raphael, Beatrice Klein, and 12 strays stood in a half circle. No one spoke a word. There was no priest, no prayer, only the sound of the sea below the hill, and the wind moving through the dry grass of February. Caleb carved the words himself into a rough granite stone he had brought back from the eastern shore of the hill 3 days later. No name, no date of birth, no date of death, only 4 words, cut by hand, each letter slightly uneven from the one beside it, but clearly legible. He chose me too. 10 years after that night by the fireplace, Caleb Bianchi was 47, with silver now at both temples, and a narrow silver streak running along the scar at his jaw, standing on the back porch of the Marblehead estate at sunset on an evening in June. Winter, 38, 7 months pregnant with their second child, rested one hand on her belly and the other on her husband's hand. Their first daughter, Isabella Marlene Bianchi, 8 years old, was running across the lawn below with a young black Neapolitan Mastiff, 2 years old. The dog had been given to Caleb on his 44th birthday by one of the strays who had raised a litter from a licensed breeder in Vermont. And Raphael had said as he placed the puppy in Caleb's arms, "This one's from the same noble lineage as Shadow. You don't have to take him if you're not ready." Caleb had taken him. He named him Echo, because every shadow has an echo. Echo ran around Isabella Marlene's feet, barking happily to the sound of her laughter, and Caleb turned his head toward the eastern hill, where the rough granite stone had stood for 10 years beneath the sea wind, where green moss had covered half its face, where it had become so much a part of the hillside that the newer gardeners no longer knew it was a grave at all. He whispered softly enough that only Winter could hear. "We're home, old friend." In Boston, people still tell the story of that once in 10 years snowstorm night, of the man who walked out through the gate of the Beacon Hill mansion with a bleeding dog in his arms and nothing else, of how he lost everything in one night and found everything again in 10 years. People call it a legend. But Caleb Bianchi, when asked, says only one thing. There is no legend. There was only a dog that refused to die, a woman who refused to close her door at 3 in the morning, and a man who finally learned how to choose the right thing worth losing everything for. And sometimes, when the sea wind blows across the Marblehead Hill from exactly the right direction, the gardeners say they can hear the low growl of a dog beneath the rough granite stone, as though he is still standing watch, as though he never truly left. The story of Caleb and Shadow, leaves us with a deep lesson about the value of loyalty, of unconditional love, and of the choice between what is right and what is easy. In a world where people often measure one another's worth by numbers, by power, by reputation, there are creatures that do not know how to count, do not know how to calculate, only how to remain beside us when the whole world turns away. And it is often those very creatures that teach us the greatest lesson of all about what it means to be human. A man can lose everything in one night, but if he keeps his mercy, he hasn't lost anything at all. A woman can carry an entire family on her shoulders for years, and when she opens the door for a stranger at 3 a.m, she doesn't know that she has just opened her entire life. And a dog left behind in the snow can become the reason an empire falls. A truth is revealed, and a broken heart is stitched back together. If this story touched you in any way, if you believe kindness is still a force in this world, if you have ever loved a living creature enough to let it change your life, please leave a comment below this video and share your own story. A story about a person, an animal, or a moment that taught you something about loyalty and forgiveness. We read every comment, and every feeling you share is a reminder that stories like this still matter. Please press the like button if this video touched your heart, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next moving stories we will tell you every day. We wish all of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, peace in every day, and that you always find the people and the creatures worthy of your opening the door for them at 3 a.m. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.